Room correction software can fix your room at a fraction of the cost of acoustic treatment. So why bother with panels at all? Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And in this video, we're going to talk about whether room correction software can replace your acoustic treatment. Now, the short answer is obviously no, but it is useful when used correctly. But before we get into it, if you already know that acoustic treatment is the right move and you want to do it properly, then I've put together a complete system for you. Acoustic Treatment Essentials gives you the full picture. So from setting up your listening position and your speakers, to building your own bass traps that actually control the low end, to placing your panels and making sure you put them where it actually counts. So the phantom speaker test for placement, build a better bass trap for construction, and absorber placement hacks for getting every panel in the right spot, plus an advanced module where I give you a review of your treatment plan so you know that you're ready to get started. And it's exactly the same process that I walk my consulting clients through, but as a self-paced course, obviously at a fraction of the price. So if you think that's what you need, check it out. The link is in the description. So let's get back to talking about room correction. And I think the first thing we need to talk about is why you might think that room correction can even replace your acoustic treatment. And it's pretty simple. At least some time ago, these software packages used to market themselves as room correction. And although that's not the case anymore, if you actually look at, for example, Sound ID SonarWorks, they don't call it room correction anymore, probably because it was a bit misleading. And that's really the point. It isn't room correction. It is speaker equalization, right? They don't correct the room in any way. It's basically just slapping equalization on your speaker output in order to compensate certain issues in the frequency response that are created by the response of the room. And obviously it's accessible, it's affordable, and it's really quick in comparison to the effort of actually planning, building, and installing acoustic treatment in your room. And then obviously the before and after examples that some of these software packages give you in terms of the frequency response, they're really impressive. But you got to watch out because a lot of times what they actually give you is a simulated response and not actually a measured response. It's a little marketing hack right there. And usually it's kind of cheated a bit, if you will, because it looks a lot better than what it actually is in practice. Nonetheless, it is impressive. And the point that I'm really trying to make is that the frequency response really is only half the picture, right? So the critical distinction that you have to make is between the frequency response, the frequency domain on one hand, and the time domain on the other hand, right? So one is how the frequency response looks, the tonal balance that you're perceiving from your speakers at the listening position. But then there is the time aspect, the decay of your room, how long sound lingers on inside your room depending on its construction, its size, its shape, the materials, all that, right? And like I just mentioned before, these speaker calibration systems really only work on the frequency domain. So they correct the frequency response that you are perceiving at your listening position. So for example, if your response is bass heavy or there's too much mid-frequency buildup, maybe there's not enough high end, those are things that these systems can compensate for. But only acoustic treatment actually works in the time domain, right? So damping standing waves or reducing the impact of reflections and just overall reducing the decay time of sound in your room. In a nutshell, basically reducing the reverb time of your room. And what's important to understand here is that the effect, the improvement that you see from acoustic treatment in the frequency domain is basically a secondary effect to controlling the time domain, right? Because, for example, with standing waves, they can create these large peaks and dips. And if you then damp that standing wave, if you reduce its resonance, then those peaks come down and those dips come up. So it's a secondary effect to damping the time aspect, the way that these resonances, these standing waves linger on inside your room. And it's the same with reflections, right? So the aspect that messes basically with your frequency response is the comb filter that a reflected sound creates when it interferes with the direct sound. And it's that interference pattern that we see as a messing up of the frequency response, right? So if you then stop that reflection, it cannot interfere with the direct sound, and so the frequency response evens out because that comb filter is never created, or at least not created at the same level, to the same extent, basically. And so if you're thinking about these speaker calibration systems, they can't touch the time domain. Once the sound leaves the speakers, there's nothing that equalizing that sound or changing the level of the sound can do to stop a certain wall reflecting sound or a standing wave building up, right? So speaker calibration systems cannot compensate for the deficiencies of your room. They can adapt or counteract the frequency response aspect of that at the listening position, but that's it. They will not stop a resonance, a standing wave lingering on. They will not reduce the reverb time in your room. That's just an aspect of the acoustic response of your room and has nothing to do with the speakers themselves. Once the sound leaves the speakers, there's nothing that equalizing that sound can do about how the room actually responds. Now, at this point, you might say, hey, hang on, Jesko, but it says in some of this marketing that they do time correction. So what's that all about? So the thing here is to understand is the difference between the time response of the room and the time response of the speaker, right? So one thing that you really only get to understand once you dive a little deeper into speaker design is that the sound from the speaker, or rather the kind of different sections of the frequency response, do not leave the speaker at the same time. Usually high frequencies leave the speaker first, and then as you go down in frequency towards the lows, they get more and more delayed, right? And so actually the low frequencies leave a speaker much later than high frequencies. And this is something that is most apparent in the phase response or the impulse response. And some of these speaker calibration systems basically do a time correction which corrects for that change in phase response, or that basically messed up impulse response, if you will. Basically, they make sure that all of the sound, or at least most of it, apart from the very lows, all of the sound leaves the speaker at the same time. That's called phase compensation or impulse response correction. Yeah? And maybe you've already heard that some speakers have this built in as well. The point being is that this is something different than the time response of the room. We are talking, when we're talking about acoustic treatment, about the lingering of sound in the room and not the delay of certain frequencies as it exits the speaker. Now, things become really problematic if you rely too heavily on speaker calibration systems, because they can really mess things up in a way that isn't actually helpful. And the first and most obvious one is simply that they rob your speakers of headroom, of usable volume, if they try to boost certain frequencies in order to do their compensation work. What then happens is that at that frequency where the system, the speaker calibration, boosts the sound in the speaker, basically the speaker distorts earlier. It needs a lot more power to play that particular frequency. And if the speaker isn't built for that kind of power, it either distorts, or the kind of flip side of it is that you can't turn things up as loud. And maybe you've seen this as well in some of these software packages, that when they run their calibration, there's also a slider that actually reduces the output volume. And that's simply to compensate for the fact that the speakers need more headroom in order to implement the boost as part of this calibration. Now, obviously, what you might want to do is kind of just cap how much the system can boost energy into the speaker. And again, referencing Sound ID SonarWorks, there's a section in there where you can actually limit the boost. I believe you can limit it to like a 12 dB boost or a 6 dB boost or even no boost at all. And ideally, if you can get away with not boosting at all, that really is the best option because it doesn't actually require your speaker to deliver more power at certain frequencies. And so this whole headroom issue basically disappears. But sometimes that's not possible. And again, coming back to why this is a problem, if you rely too heavily on it and there are certain sections where you really need to boost in order to get the tonal balance even into kind of the ballpark, then you're stuck with it. And if that means 12 dB boosts, then things might get difficult. The other problem is that speaker equalization can't compensate for certain acoustic effects that are causing these issues. So for example, there are certain situations where you can't really EQ a standing wave. In the same way, there are certain circumstances where you can't EQ a dip caused by a speaker boundary interference, for example. And this becomes really complicated really quickly. It can get really messy trying to figure out which aspects of the frequency response you can actually correct. And there are different philosophies about this as well. So some software packages will focus only on the mids and the high end because they just assume that they can't correct any problems caused by standing waves. On the other hand, you might have the exact opposite, where certain software packages focus only on the low end and don't actually touch the mids and highs. It's really funny because in the end, I found that this is completely situation dependent. And ultimately, you really need to figure out just how far you can push the speaker calibration in terms of both low end and a high end. And it's completely dependent on your room, your speakers, and what exact problems you might want to calibrate for, that you might want to compensate for. Maybe you've even experienced it yourself. These automatic calibration systems can make mistakes, and there are some that just purely vanilla out of the box work better than others, but I've definitely seen some that just make a complete mess of it, and you cannot actually use the standard calibration that it comes up with. You really need to tweak it quite heavily in order for it to become useful. But so in a nutshell, basically that means that you want to rely on speaker calibration the least amount possible. Basically, the less it has to work, the better it's probably going to be. And so you really want to get as much out of all the other steps that you can take in improving the sound from your speakers before you apply any type of speaker calibration. Now, to go on a quick side tangent, there are also these room emulation systems for headphones. You can pick different types of studios that are then simulated on your headphones. And sometimes I get asked about these as well, whether that won't make the studio completely redundant in the first place. And I just have to kind of say a quick disclaimer here. I haven't tried any of these systems yet. I don't really know anybody who uses them either. That said, here are some thoughts. Basically, I'm somewhat skeptical, mainly because, as with all things, usually there isn't a proper substitute for the real deal. It also obviously is completely dependent on the quality of the headphones, right? Because you're trying to represent a different sound field as accurately as possible. And depending on the limitations of the headphones, that might be better or not so great at all. But the real reason that I'm skeptical is mainly a workflow question. So it's not about the quality of the system, but just how useful it is in the broader context of mixing, of developing an effective and efficient workflow to get to the goal of having your mixes translate. So in my experience, and with what I'm seeing with professionals around me, is that what you really want is one primary reference system that you do probably 80 to 90% of your work on. And this is a system that you know extremely well, and you know its quirks, you know its features, you know how it responds so well to the extent that you really want to do basically all of your work on them. And then you have a few select different reproduction systems. So, for example, headphones, your car, a hi-fi system, a mono box, that all give you a very different insight into the music, but they all focus on a certain aspect of the sound. Yeah, for example, with these small mono speakers, it tends to be a focus on the mids and the fact that you don't have stereo. That's the whole idea. It gives you a drastically different view on what you're actually working on. And that's much more effective and much more useful than, for example, having a second pair of two-way speakers if your main pair already is a set of two-way speakers. Yeah, because the difference between those two isn't going to be that huge. Yes, you'll hear it, but in the broader context of working, of workflow, of understanding what you need to do to the music, it's probably not that useful. And so with that context, how useful is it going to be able to listen to 20 different studios? I'm not sure. I think there's a potential there for that to be more confusing than anything else. That said, it might work great for some people. Yeah, and if that's you, great. Ultimately, obviously, all we want to do here is find an effective and efficient way to get to the goal. And if these types of room emulators do that for you, great. But so coming back to the whole speaker calibration issue, the question then obviously becomes, when do you implement it to get the most out of it? And this is just a question of hierarchy, of priorities, right? So first up, listening position and speakers, followed by as much treatment, proper acoustic treatment as you can do, right? In terms of budget, in terms of time, in terms of space. And this is going to be different for everybody, but you basically want to get as much out of that as you possibly can. And only then do you want to apply speaker calibration in order to pick up the slack of what you couldn't do with treatment and with placement. Yeah. And there is a place for speaker calibration in this process, especially in home studios, because one thing that you usually can't change is the natural tonal balance of the room permeating through this entire process, right? So you just have to imagine that basically the room in its empty, naked form gives you a certain natural response, and you can balance that out as best as you can with speaker and listener position placement, and then you can improve on that with acoustic treatment, right? So like I said before, damping standing waves or reducing reflections, and that will basically reduce the amount of individual swing that you're seeing in the frequency response. But the overall curve is something that permeates through this entire process. And even though you can improve it, usually in home studios, you can't get it to the point where you don't need some form of touch-up in terms of tonal adjustment to get it where nothing is lacking to the extent that it becomes a problem. And that's really where speaker calibration shines, because it can give you that last tweak, right? It can get you that last mile in terms of tonal balance, which you can't get from all the other steps in the process. Doesn't mean they're not useful. Like I said, quite the opposite. You want to get as much out of them as possible. In some cases, you might find, if you're lucky, that you don't need any speaker calibration. But in most cases, a small touch-up usually helps just to kind of get it just across the finish line. And this is exactly what I laid out in my home studio treatment framework, right? So it's a roadmap, a very top-level perspective, the 5 steps that you need to take in order to take your room from empty to fully treated. It's completely for free. You can check that out in the link in the description. And what I just mentioned is in there, and it describes exactly this process in full detail so you understand what to focus on at which step in the process. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. Speaker calibration systems do not do room correction. They cannot correct for the room. What they do is basically equalize the output from your speakers, not the room. And you still want to focus on acoustic treatment as much as possible, because only acoustic treatment can actually change and improve the time aspect of your room, right? So the decay, the reverb time, reflections, standing waves, reduce the impact those have on the time domain, and then as a secondary effect on the frequency domain. So when you're thinking about using these speaker calibration systems, still make sure you do it in the correct order. Placement first, then acoustic treatment, and then speaker calibration. And you basically want to run the speaker calibration again anytime you make a major change to the acoustics of your studio. So if you change your listening position, if you move your speakers, if you change the treatment, if you move any furniture, all that will change the acoustic response of your room. They will change the frequency response of your room. And so the calibration needs to change in order to adapt to that, in order to integrate that into the actual response that you're then playing through your speakers. And I actually made a full video about how to master room correction. You can check that out in the card right now. I'll also put it in the description as well. So if you want a proper strategy on how to approach room correction systems, speaker calibration systems, go watch that next. But right now, I hope that puts things in perspective. And as always, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.